Let's dive right into a truly fascinating historical journey today. We're going to be looking at how a faith that started with a tiny, localized group of first-century Jewish followers evolved, expanded, and literally transformed into the most globally diffused religion on the planet. And it's a story not just about historical events, but about this intense, centuries-long struggle to define an identity. They had to pinpoint a core essence that could somehow hold a massively diverse group of believers together across millennia. So, Section 1, a complex global faith. To really grasp this, we have to start by looking at the sheer, staggering scale of the faith as it exists right now. 2 billion. Yep, that's 2 billion with a B. That staggering number really just says it all. Christianity is the most geographically widely diffused of all world religions today, with a massive constituency of over 2 billion believers. It is an astronomical figure. And when you have a group this large, spread across literally every corner of the globe, the natural consequence is an incredible, almost overwhelming level of complexity. Because we're definitely not just talking about one uniform group of people here. This umbrella covers a completely bewildering variety of traditions. I mean, you've got the massive Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, right alongside Protestant traditions. Then you have the Oriental Orthodox churches, which, fun fact, represent one of the oldest branches of the tradition, even though they were out of contact with Western Christianity for centuries. And on top of all the whole shebang, you have these rapidly growing modern movements that cross old boundaries. Things like Pentecostalism, charismatic Christianity, evangelicalism, and countless independent churches popping up around the world. So, faced with thousands of distinct groups, it brings up a totally natural historical detective question. How on earth do you simplify something this massive? Imagine you're a historian trying to figure this out. How do you look at a monk praying in a quiet, ancient monastery and, say, a teenager worshiping in a massive, high-energy modern megachurch and identify the single thread that connects them? Well, that brings us to Section 2, the core Christian essence. To answer our detective question, we have to zoom way in and look at the historical attempt to distill its absolute center. Throughout history, defining the essence has been the go-to way to separate the central focus of the faith from outside influences. The term essence itself actually comes from, well, strictly speaking, it comes from ancient Greek philosophy. To those early thinkers, an essence meant something intrinsic and inherent, the absolute core qualities that give something its character and completely separate it from everything else. So when early scholars and believers were trying to define Christianity, they weren't just listing out rules. They were desperately trying to find the unique identity that made their faith different from literally every other ancient religion or philosophy out there. And historically, scholars have boiled this down to 3 core pillars that make up the simplified essence. When you strip away the varying cultures, the different architectural styles of the churches, and the thousands of denominations, you're left with these 3 foundational ideas that pretty much have to be present. Let's break them down. Pillar number 1 is an absolute focus on Jesus Christ, but here's the absolutely crucial distinction. The vast majority of Christians focus their faith on Jesus, not just as some historical teacher who lived back in the 1st century, but as a present, living reality. The earliest believers were completely unified on this point. For there to be any Christian faith tradition at all, they had to agree that Jesus was the risen and ascended Lord, somehow elevated way above ordinary mortal experience and actively present in their everyday lives and worship. Then, the 2nd and 3rd pillars are deeply intertwined. Believers picture themselves in a fundamental plight. You might have heard theologians later describe this as original sin, but basically it's the idea that humanity is somehow distanced or alienated from God, totally unable to achieve perfection on its own. And because of this universal plight, there's a desperate need for a definitive rescue mission, a plan of salvation or redemption. In this framework, Jesus acts as the unique agent of that redemption. He's the one who bridges the gap, buys back humanity, and returns us to our source in God. Moving on to Section 3, the early monotheistic dilemma. Establishing this exact 3-part essence was an agonizing struggle for the earliest followers. You see, to really understand the friction here, you have to look at their roots. Jesus and his earliest followers were Jewish. They were born into the Hebrew tradition, they embraced the Hebrew scriptures, and most importantly, they were fiercely, strictly devoted to a single God. They were unwavering monotheists, living in a Roman world that was just absolutely packed with competing polytheistic gods. And this presented a massive, massive early dilemma for the young faith as they tried to figure out their own beliefs. Think about it. If you're deeply committed to the idea that there is only one God, How do you claim that Jesus is divine without accidentally creating a second God? How do you elevate Jesus without throwing away the core monotheism you inherited from Judaism and just slipping right back into the polytheism of the Romans? It was the ultimate puzzle they had to solve. Naturally, different groups tried wildly different ways to solve it. For example, some early Jewish Christian groups, like the Ebionites, used a rather surprising metaphor: adoption. They suggested that the divine parent simply adopted Jesus, taking him into the heart of God's nature, kind of like how an earthly parent might adopt a child. It was a really creative attempt to maintain the oneness of God while honoring the divinity of Jesus. But honestly, it was just one of many early variations as the faith scrambled to articulate its true essence. Which leads us perfectly into section 4, from faith to doctrine. Let's look at how this essence solidifies as the faith expanded outward into the Greco-Roman world. Notice the stark historical contrast here. The Hebrew tradition pictured a relatively intimate God, a God who made a starry universe but then directly spoke to humans, making covenants and acting in historical events. But as the faith moved into the Greek world, the focus shifted heavily to abstract ideas. Greek thinkers needed a God who was greater than mere concepts but had to be addressed through precise philosophy. So faith actually shifted from an experiential belief in something that happened to cognitive beliefs about specific rigid doctrines. Tracking this chronologically is super helpful. In the 1st century, you have the Jewish experience and the teachings of Jesus. But by the 2nd century, you get these Christian apologists, writers essentially defending the faith to Greco-Roman society. And to explain Jesus to Greek philosophers, they used Greek concepts. They identified Jesus as the pre-existent logos, which was this cosmic principle of reason and order that existed in the Godhead before taking on human flesh. And you know what? This philosophical translation was so successful that by the late 4th century, the faith actually triumphed and became the official religion of the Roman Empire. Crazy, right? But as always, with massive imperial success comes a strict need for definition. To figure out exactly who had the best credentials and who held the true essence, church leaders in the 3rd through 6th centuries gathered in these intense, high-stakes councils. They merged Greek philosophical vocabulary, words like substance and being, which weren't even in the Bible, with their scriptures to create rigid confessions and creeds. The essence of the faith was no longer just a shared experience, it became a doctrinal boundary used to draw hard lines between true insiders and heretical outsiders. Ironically, for a faith rooted in love and grace, the stakes for getting this philosophical vocabulary wrong were incredibly high now that it was tied to the power of the Roman Empire. Failing to grasp this highly defined essence could literally mean harassment, exile, or even death. This ancient boundary-drawing exercise was perfectly summed up by the 5th century theologian Saint Vincent of Lerins. He boldly defined the true essence of Christianity as that which has been believed everywhere, always, and by all. It's a beautiful, highly idealized formula, right? Just aiming for absolute, universal agreement across the entire Christian world? Which leaves us with a truly fascinating paradox to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. If the ultimate original goal of all those early councils, the apologists, the theologians, was to pinpoint a singular unified essence that was believed exactly the same way by everyone everywhere, how on earth did that exact historical search evolve into the beautifully complex, brilliantly varied, and wonderfully diverse global faith of 2 billion people we observe today? It's a true historical marvel, and I think it's a testament to how an essence, no matter how strictly you define it on parchment, will always take on the dynamic, ever-changing life of the real people who carry it forward. Just something to think about as you consider how massive ideas travel through time.